Hello and welcome back to the Align and Shine podcast with me, your host, Coach Joyce, where we are tried by fire, restored from the ashes, and established in faith. And today we are on episode 4 of my From Confusion to Clarity podcast series, and we are going to be talking about the obedience gap that causes us to remain stuck and causes us to end up in a confusion cycle loop. So, before we move into anything today, I want to slow this down intentionally because this episode is not designed to give you more information. It's designed to help you recognize something that may have been happening inside you for a long time without you having the language for it. In the last few episodes, we've been building a foundation. We talked about confusion, overthinking, and we talked about discernment and how people often struggle not because they lack truth, but because they struggle to distinguish what they are actually responding to internally. But today we are stepping into something deeper than all of that because there is a moment that many people eventually come to where something very unsettling happens internally. It sounds like this: I actually know what to do, or I already understand what needs to change, or I already see the direction, but I still feel stuck. Sound familiar? That moment is extremely important because it reveals something that confusion and overthinking alone do not explain. It reveals that the issue is no longer about information. It's about internal resistance to movement. And most people label that moment, mislabel that moment. And instead they assume I must not be hearing God clearly, or I must need more confirmation, or I must be missing something. But what if nothing is missing? What if the clarity is already present, but something inside you is still resisting execution? Because if that's the case, then it changes the entire diagnosis. And if you misdiagnose resistance as confusion, you will spend your life looking for answers that you have already received. So today we're not asking, what do I need to know? We are asking something far more revealing. What is happening inside of me that makes movement feel difficult even when clarity is present? Because that's where transformation begins. So now let's talk about the obedience gap and how it, whether or not it's really a psychological and spiritual divide. So this is going to have us go deeper into what stuckness actually is, because most people think stuckness is a lack of clarity, but in reality, stuckness is often a split in the internal system. There's a gap between knowing and doing, but that gap is not empty. It's filled with internal tension. On one side, there's clarity. This is the part of you that already knows what needs to change, what direction is right, what conviction has already been formed, what truth you cannot unsee anymore. And this is not confusion, that's awareness. But on the other side of that awareness is something else entirely: resistance. And resistance is not always loud, it does not always say no. Sometimes it sounds more like not yet, or wait until later, think about it more, be careful, what if something goes wrong? Similar to the way fear can sound. And this is where people begin to misunderstand themselves, because they assume both voices are equal in truth, but they're not. One is clarity and the other is protection. So let's slow this down, because this is where transformation begins. Your internal world is not just a thinking system, it is also a protective system. And protection systems are not designed to move you forward. They are designed to keep you emotionally safe based on past experience. So even when truth enters, your awareness, your internal system does not automatically align with it. Instead, it evaluates it. And here's what it evaluates: will this cost me comfort? Will this disrupt relationships? Will this change my identity? Will this create uncertainty? Will this force me into something unfamiliar? And if the answer is yes to any of those, resistance is triggered. Not because the truth is wrong, but because the system prioritizes stability over growth. And this is where people get stuck spiritually without realizing it. They assume if it's God, it should feel easier. But often biblical obedience is not easy. It is clear, but it's costly. And that is a completely different experience, because clarity does not remove resistance. Clarity exposes resistance. And once resistance is exposed, you are now at a crossroads. Do I move with what I know, or do I negotiate with what I feel? And most people stay in the negotiation stage, not because they're rebellious, but because internal resistance feels like wisdom when it is actually fear-based protection. So stuckness is not confusion. It is a conflict between clarity and comfort systems inside the human mind. And whichever one you reinforce repeatedly becomes dominant. So let's go deeper into something most people never consider when they feel stuck. Sometimes you are not stuck because you lack discipline. Sometimes you're stuck because your brain is actually rewarding delay. And that sounds counterintuitive, but it's important to understand how human behavior actually works. Your brain is constantly evaluating three things: reward, risk, and effort. And whatever feels like the lowest immediate cost with the highest immediate relief will become the default choice. So now here's how this connects to stuckness. When you are faced with something you already know you should do, such as having a conversation, or changing a habit, or leaving a situation, or starting something new, or stopping something destructive, your brain immediately begins running a calculation. And it says, what does this cost me right now? And the key word is right now. Not later, not long term, immediate emotional cost. And this is where delay becomes powerful, because not acting on something produces something very specific internally. Relief, not peace, relief. And relief is extremely powerful because it removes pressure in the moment. So your system begins to learn something where it learns that thinking about it equals discomfort. So then delaying it produces relief. And over time, your brain begins to associate delay with emotional safety. So now you are not just dealing with a decision, you are dealing with a conditioned response loop. And this is why people say things like, I don't know why I can't just do it. But the truth is, your brain has learned that not acting reduces immediate emotional tension. And anything that reduces tension feels like the safer path in the moment. So let's bring this into deeper understanding, because this is where people misinterpret themselves spiritually. They assume if I really wanted to change, I would. But desire is not the only force that's operating here. There is also conditioning, and conditioning often overrides desire. So even when you genuinely want to change, your brain is still pulling you toward what feels emotionally stable in the present moment because of your conditioning. So here's where this becomes spiritually significant, because obedience to God often requires short-term discomfort for long-term alignment. But the fleshly system in the mind prioritizes short-term relief over long-term transformation. And those two systems are constantly in conflict. So when God leads someone toward a necessary step internally, it can feel like resistance, hesitation, emotional weight, mental friction, and a sudden desire to postpone. And it's not because the instruction is unclear. It's because the brain is interpreting the instruction as a disruption to emotional stability. This is why many people experience a very specific pattern. They feel clarity, then they delay, then clarity weakens, then confusion increases, then they think they missed God. But in reality, what happened is not spiritual disappearance. It is neurological reconditioning through inaction. Because when you do not act on clarity, your brain does something very important. It recalibrates the importance of that clarity downward. It begins to file it as optional instead of urgent. And so once something becomes optional internally, it ends up losing urgency. And once urgency is lost, motivation tends to collapse. So now you are not stuck because you lack truth. Instead, you're stuck because repeated delay has reduced the internal weight of truth. So now let's connect this to something deeper, because this is where emotional struggle begins to feel spiritual. When you delay long enough, your internal system starts to create what feels like distance from clarity. So people begin to say things like, I don't feel as convicted anymore, or I don't feel as sure anymore, or I'm not as clear as I used to be. But what they're actually experiencing is not a removal of truth. It is the fading of emotional intensity due to repeated non-response. And this is extremely important because conviction is not just awareness. Conviction is awareness that demands response. When response is consistently withheld, conviction weakens in perceived intensity. Not because God changed, but because the internal system adapted to delay. Now, from a spiritual perspective, this creates something dangerous because a person can remain aware of truth, but no longer feel urgency toward it. And that creates the illusion of neutrality. But neutrality is not actually neutral, it is gradual alignment with avoidance. So now stuckness becomes self sustaining. Delay reduces urgency, which then translates to that reduced urgency increasing delay. And that increased delay strengthens avoidance. And then avoidance weakens action identity. And the cycle continues. So, what feels like I'm stuck is actually I am forcing non movement as my default response. And now, here's the key shift we need to understand before moving forward. You do not break this cycle by thinking more. You break it by interrupting the reward pattern of delay, because the brain must relearn what relief it is connected to. Right now, relief is connected to avoidance, but transformation requires relief to be connected to obedience. And that shift does not happen through insight alone. It happens through action, small action, repeated action, consistent action, even when resistance is present. So now that we understand the internal reward system behind delay, we need to go deeper into something even more subtle. Because even after people recognize the pattern, they still struggle to move. And why do you think that is? Well, because resistance is not just behavioral, it becomes identity based. And that is where we go next. So now we go deeper because we've already established something important in the previous segment. Stuckness is not just a thinking issue. It's not just a discipline issue. It's not even only a spiritual clarity issue. It's at a deeper level, stuckness is often an identity protection issue. And this is where many people become confused about themselves, because on the surface, they will say, I want to change. I know what I need to do. I don't want to stay like this. But internally, something else is happening at the same time that contradicts that desire. There is an internal identity system that is asking a completely different question. And that question is, if I change this, who will I become? Because you see, every meaningful act of obedience doesn't just change behavior. It threatens an existing identity structure. And identity structures are built over time through repeated choices, emotional experiences, coping mechanisms, survival patterns, relational dynamics, and learned beliefs about yourself. So when you try to move in a new direction, you're not just confronting a decision, you're also confronting an internal version of yourself that has existed for years. And that version of you has a sense of stability, even if it's not healthy. And so now here's the key insight: the human mind prefers a familiar identity over an unknown transformation, even if the familiar identity is painful, even if it is limiting, even if it is unproductive, because familiarity creates psychological stability. So when God begins to lead someone into change, what often happens internally is not immediate excitement. Instead, it is internal resistance that sounds like things like, that's not really me, or I don't know if I can do that, or that feels like too much, or I've never been that type of person, or that's just not who I am. And notice something very important: none of those statements are about your ability, they are about your identity. Because identity silently dictates behavior more than intention ever will. So now let's bring this into spiritual clarity. When God calls someone forward, he is not just giving instructions, he is inviting transformation. And transformation always requires identity adjustment. And this is why scripture doesn't only say do different things. It says be transformed by the renewing of your mind, Romans 12:2. So notice the emphasis is not just behavior change, it's becoming something new internally. But identity does not change easily because identity is protected. And what protects identity? Comfort patterns, familiar thinking, emotional safety systems. So even when truth is clear, identity resistance begins to activate because part of you recognizes, if I obey this, I cannot stay the same version of myself. And that creates internal tension. And it's not because obedience is wrong, but because identity is being challenged. So let's slow this down further, because this is where many people misinterpret spiritual resistance. They think, I must not be ready yet, or I must need more confirmation, or maybe this isn't the right time. But often, when they are actually, what they're actually experiencing is, I am attached to who I currently am, even though I feel called beyond it. And that creates the split. One part of you is drawn toward growth, while the other part of you is loyal to familiarity. And those two parts end up beginning to compete internally. And now, here is something very important: identity does not change through insight, it changes through repeated action. But before action happens, identity will always attempt to negotiate. It will try to preserve itself by minimizing the cost of staying the same. And that is why internal thoughts often sound like, you can do this later, or it's not that serious, or you're overthinking it, or you don't need to rush. Because identity resistance rarely says no. What it does instead is says not now. And that not now is often how transformation is delayed indefinitely. So when people feel stuck, what they are often experiencing is not confusion about direction, but instead it's loyalty to a past version of themselves that no longer aligns with where they are being called to go. And this ends up creating one of the most important internal conflicts in spiritual growth. You cannot step into a new direction while you are emotionally defending an old identity. Because whatever you protect internally will continue to lead you externally. So now let's connect this to real life. This is exactly why people can know they need to leave a situation but stay, know they need to start something but delay, know they need to change behavior but repeat patterns, know what is right but feel internally blocked. Not because they lack truth, but because truth is confronting identity. And identity resists replacement. So stuckness is not just confusion. It is often identity preservation competing with transformation. So now that we understand identity resistance, we need to go deeper into something even more subtle. Because even when identity resistance is understood, people still often feel like they can't move. And why is that? It's because the mind creates something very specific when identity is under tension. It creates false heaviness around action. And so now in this next segment, we're going to break down why decisions feel emotionally heavier than they are, how anticipation creates false pressure, why avoidance makes simple things feel overwhelming, and how mental load distorts perception of action. So, we're going to go deeper into something that most people experience but rarely understand. There are moments where the next step is actually simple. It is not complex. It is not unclear. It's not even large. And yet internally, it still feels heavy. Almost like resistance is attached to the action itself. So a person might say things like, I just can't bring myself to do it. Or it feels like too much right now. Or I don't have the energy for it. Or I'll do it later when I feel better. But here is what is actually happening beneath the surface. The action itself is not heavy. The anticipation of the action is what creates the weight. So your mind does not only respond to reality, it responds to predicted experience. So before you take an action, your mind runs a simulation of what will this feel like if I do it. And in that simulation, it includes emotional discomfort, possible rejection, uncertainty, awkwardness, confrontation, vulnerability, and identity exposure. So even before anything happens externally, internally, you are already experiencing the cost of the action. And that internal simulation produces something very important. It produces emotional load. Not real load, but a perceived load. And perceived load often feels more intense than actual experience. So now here's where stuckness deepens, because when the mind repeatedly simulates discomfort without action, it begins to amplify the perceived difficulty. So over time, small actions feel bigger, simple steps feel complex, basic obedience feels overwhelming, not because the action changed, but because your mental anticipation system became overstimulated. So now, again, let's connect this spiritually and practically, because this is where many people misread themselves. They assume that things like that if it feels this heavy, maybe I shouldn't do it. But you need to understand that heaviness is not always a spiritual sign. Sometimes heaviness is just mental accumulation of avoided action. Because every time you delay something you already know to do, your mind stores it as unfinished internal business. And unfinished internal business creates background pressure. So now your internal world is carrying unmade decisions, unspoken conversations, unstarted actions, unresolved obedience. And all of that builds what feels like emotional weight. So when you finally think about doing it, you are not just facing the action, you're also facing the accumulated mental weight of every previous delay. And that is why it feels so heavy. Not because the step is heavy, but because avoidance has built pressure around it. So now we're going to go deeper, because this also explains why people feel drained before they even begin and think things like, I don't have the energy for this. But often the truth is the mind is already spending energy simulating avoidance and resistance. So you are not conserving energy by delaying. You are actually spending energy internally without producing movement externally. And this is one of the hidden costs of stuckness. You feel inactive, but internally you are constantly processing the thing you are avoiding. And that creates mental fatigue without progress. So, how does this fit into clarity? Action feels heavy when it has been delayed repeatedly, it has been mentally rehearsed without execution, it is emotionally charged, it threatens identity or comfort, or it has accumulated internal narrative around it. Or it could be several of those things working together. But here's the key truth: the heaviness is not proof that you shouldn't act. It is often proof that the action has been avoided for too long. And avoidance always increases perceived difficulty. Now, let's continue this back to spiritual clarity, because many people interpret heaviness as God must be closing the door. But in many cases, what they are feeling is not spiritual resistance. Instead, it's psychological accumulation. And if you misinterpret accumulation as direction, you will begin to make decisions based on internal pressure instead of truth. So instead of moving forward, you retreat, and the cycle continues. But here is the breaking point: once you act, even slightly, the perceived heaviness begins to dissolve. Not because everything becomes easy, but because reality replaces your imagination. And imagination is where most of the heaviness lives. So the shift is not wait until it feels light. The shift is interrupt the simulation with action, because action breaks imagined weight. So now that we understand why action feels heavy, we need to go even deeper into something critical. Because even when people begin to understand all of this, they still often ask, if I already know this, why do I still struggle to move? And the answer is deeper than behavior. It involves emotional attachment to inaction itself. So, the next segment, we will explore how inaction becomes emotionally familiar, why comfort can form around avoidance, how identity starts to bond with delay, and why breaking stuckness feels like emotional loss rather than gain. So, now let's go into the hidden reward system behind delay and go into something most people never recognize in themselves. At a certain point, inaction stops feeling like a problem, and instead, it starts feeling like a place of safety. But not because it is truly safe, instead, because it is familiar. And the human mind has a very consistent pattern. What is familiar eventually begins to feel comfortable, even if it's not good for you. So when someone stays in a pattern of delay, hesitation, or avoidance long enough, something subtle begins to happen internally. The mind starts to build emotional stability around not moving. So let me explain how this develops. Every time you avoid an action you know that you should take, there are two immediate internal effects. Pressure decreases and emotional relief increases. So, in that moment, your system experiences something it interprets as good, not necessarily morally good, but emotionally relieving. And your brain records that pattern of when I don't act, I feel less pressure. Now, repeat that pattern long enough and enough times, and your nervous system ends up starting to build a reward association with avoidance. So now inaction is no longer just a decision. Instead, it becomes a relief mechanism. And here is where it becomes spiritually and psychologically important. Because what you begin to call peace is sometimes not peace at all. It is simply the absence of internal pressure caused by delay. And those are not the same thing. Peace moves you toward clarity. Relief often just removes discomfort temporarily. Because over time, something even stronger forms. As I said before, inaction ends up becoming part of your identity, not consciously, but emotionally. So you begin to build internal narratives like, I guess I'm just not someone who moves quickly, or I take time to decide things, or I struggle with follow through, or I overthink everything. And what starts as behavior ends up becoming self-definition. Now, this is critical because once behavior becomes identity, resistance to change will increase dramatically, because now moving forward doesn't just feel like doing something new. Instead, it feels like becoming somebody completely different. And the mind resists identity disruption far more than it resists effort. So now stuckness is no longer just I'm not doing the thing, it becomes that is who I am. And that is much harder to challenge internally. So let's connect this to something deeper, because inaction doesn't just create comfort, it also creates predictability. And predictability is powerful emotionally, because even when life is not fulfilling, predictable emotional patterns feel safer than unknown outcomes. So the mind begins to prefer known discomfort, familiar frustration, predictable cycles, or unknown growth over unknown growth, because that unknown growth carries uncertainty, and uncertainty feels like risk. So now a person is not just avoiding action, they are protecting their emotional stability. And this is where stuckness becomes self-perpetuating and creates, because avoidance creates relief, and that relief reinforces avoidance, and then avoidance becomes identity, and identity resists change, and resistance increases avoidance, and the cycle continues and deepens. Now here is a very important truth. From the outside, people see lack of discipline, but internally the person is experiencing what feels like I am maintaining emotional stability by not moving. And that is why encouragement alone often doesn't break stuckness, because you are not just asking someone to act, you are asking them to disrupt an internal reward system they've been living in. So now let's bring clarity to this spiritually, because many people assume things like, if God is leading me, it should feel consistently motivating. But scripture shows us something very different. God often calls people out of familiarity, and familiarity always resists disruption. So obedience is not just about direction, it is about leaving internal comfort zones that were built through repetition. And so now here's the key realization in this segment. Stuckness is not maintained because change is impossible. Instead, it is maintained because staying the same has become emotionally easier in the moment. But easier in the moment does not mean healthier in the long term. And so this is where transformation begins. When a person realizes that what feels like safety is actually a cycle of emotional maintenance rather than growth. So now we are ready to move into the next layer, because once you see that inaction becomes identity, the next question becomes unavoidable. So in this next segment, we will go into how identity is actually rewritten through small actions, and why motivation is not the starting point, as well as how to interrupt emotional reward cycles, and how biblical obedience patterns reset internal alignment. So now that we've built the full picture, clarity, resistance, brain reward systems, identity attachment, and emotional comfort loops, we need to answer the real question. What actually breaks this? Because understanding stuckness is not the same as escaping it. And many people stay trapped at that level of insight, because where they can explain themselves perfectly, but still move differently. So let's go deeper into what actually shifts a person out of these cycles. And I want to start with something very important. You do not break stuckness by trying to feel ready. Let me say it again. You do not break stuckness by trying to feel ready. Instead, you break stuckness by interrupting the identity loop that was formed through repetition. So let's slow that down. Everything that we've talked about so far has built a pattern. Avoidance creates relief. Relief reinforces delay. Delay strengthens identity. Identity resists change. Resistance increases avoidance. So if nothing interrupts that cycle, it will continue indefinitely. That means transformation cannot begin at the level of thought alone. It must begin at the level of behavioral interruption. And so here's the key truth. Identity is not primarily changed by reflection. Identity is changed by repeated evidence. And evidence is created through action, even small action, even uncomfortable action, even imperfect action. Because every time you take a step you previously avoided, something very important happens internally. You introduce new data into your identity system, and identity begins to update based on evidence, not on intention. So the question is not, how do I feel different first? The question is, what action creates new evidence that I am not who I've been behaving like? Now let's go deeper, because this is where most people misunderstand transformation. They think I need motivation to act. But motivation is actually a result of motion. It's not a requirement for it. When you act, even slightly, you disrupt the internal reward system we discussed earlier. Because now your brain experiences something new. It starts saying, action did not destroy me. Action did not overwhelm me. Action did not collapse my world. And that matters more than people realize, because the mind is not primarily logical. As we said before, it's protective, and it builds its resistance based on past perceived outcomes. So when you avoid action, you confirm the belief, this is too risky. But when you act, even in a small way, you begin to rewrite that belief. So let's make this practical in a deeper way. Breaking the stuck identity loop requires three things. First, you have to break the waiting for feeling illusion. And that's one of the strongest traps, is waiting until you feel internally aligned before acting. But feelings were never designed to lead obedience. Feelings respond to interruption, not truth. So if you wait for emotional readiness, you are actually waiting for a system that only changes after movement, not before. So the shift is this: you don't act because you feel ready. You act because you refuse to let feeling remain the gatekeeper of your obedience. Number two is reduce the action until it is no longer resisted. Most people stay stuck because they define action too large. They think I need to fix everything, or I need to change my whole life, or I need to get this completely right. But identity does not shift through overwhelming steps. It shifts through repeatable steps. So instead of, I need to completely change this area of my life, you ask, what is the smallest possible action that breaks the pattern of avoidance? Not the ideal action, not, but the accessible action, because accessibility determines follow through. So if you make the action too large, you're going to be more likely to continue to delay movement. Number 3 is to reassociate action with safety through repetition. Because right now, avoidance feels safe. So the goal is not to shame avoidance. The goal is to retrain the system. And that only happens through repetition. Every time you act in small obedience, even with discomfort, you're teaching your nervous system that I am safe even when I move. I am stable even when I act. I am not losing control when I step forward. And over time, something shifts. Action stops feeling like threat and instead starts feeling like normal. So, how does this connect spiritually? This is where scripture becomes alive in a very practical way, because faith is not just belief, just like we learned in my Faith Requires Action series. Faith is movement based on belief. And that is why scripture says, be doers of the word, not hearers only, James 1:22. Because hearing alone does not rewire identity, doing does. And this is why God often leads people into steps, not systems, because steps create transformation. Systems without obedience create stagnation. Now, here is the final truth of this segment. You don't escape stuckness by thinking your way out of it. You escape it by acting your way into new identity patterns. And once that pattern begins to form, everything starts to shift. Clarity returns, resistance weakens, momentum builds, identity stabilizes in growth instead of avoidance. Not all at once, but consistently. So let's bring everything together. If you've been feeling stuck, unclear, or like you know what to do but can't seem to move, I want you to understand something very clearly. You are not dealing with a lack of knowledge. You are dealing with a system that has learned how to maintain stability through delay. And that system does not break through insight alone. It breaks through interruption. Small interruption, consistent interruption, intentional interruption. Because every time you choose action over avoidance, even in something small, you are not just completing a task, you are reshaping identity. And identity is what ultimately determines direction, behavior, and future outcomes. So the real question is not, why can't I move? The real question becomes, what version of me is being reinforced by my current patterns? And once that question becomes clear, the next step becomes obvious. Not always easy, but clear. And clarity, when acted on, becomes transformation. So that concludes this episode, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching, and please, if you have any questions or you need some prayer, please don't hesitate to show up in my inbox or email me